Minerva, the goddess of the sea, asked her brother Perseus to kill the gorgon, who had the power to transform everyone who crossed his path into stone. Undaunted, the young god, as he approached the monster, looked away and beheaded him by surprise. His blood flowed into the immaculate sea and turned into a gem and precious mineral. Thus was born the red coral in the depths near an island in the Mediterranean, Corsica. Fred Samuel began as a jeweler. His parents lived in Argentina, and he lived in France at the beginning of the century. Quite soon, he opened his own shop near the Place Vendôme. He clearly had a great passion for beads. Since the beginning, Fred's has always offered a lot of creativity and extensive expertise in the field of beads. But Mr. Fred Samuel had another passion, which was the sea. He was always looking for subjects that inspired him around the sea, especially marine cables, which initiated a favorite of the house called Force 10. Thus, the combination of marine cables and gold. In parallel, he looked at materials such as coral. He was passionate about beads and coral. It is quite recently that we found in the stocks of the store a suitcase of coral. A suitcase containing absolutely beautiful beads. You can see some examples on the table here. It was red coral from the Mediterranean. Corsica, the Mediterranean island jewel, is home to one of the most beautiful coral in the world. It has been coveted throughout history. Around 600,000 years before Christ, we find the first signs of human presence and, more recently, the Greeks founded a trading post. Different periods succeeded. The Romans, Byzantines, Moors, and the Genovese have all left their marks. This mountain population was the crucible of strong personalities who rocked the world. Pascal Paoli, who gave it its independence for a time, and of course Napoleon Bonaparte, who ruled France in the 19th century. Today, it is developing its economy while trying to keep its culture. Tourism is its main activity, but they still practice cork harvesting, animal husbandry in the mountains with the famous Brocchio cheap cheese, and dried meats. Corsicans are masters at making knives in memory of the famous vendetta. As for the Mediterranean sun, it helps bear a grape that gives rich wines in the four corners of the island. A key figure of this island is the strong character of its people, who particularly love to hunt a local game, wild boar. The Gulf of Porto Vecchio, without any exaggeration, was a cornucopia. It was said jokingly that we could go down the mountain with a piece of bread in hand because we knew we would find something to eat with it. When we went in the water, there were clams, there were clovis, there were the famous oysters. We went in rowboats. One was rowing, and the other one was at the bow with a long stick that ended in a horseshoe. We lowered the stick with the iron at the bottom, and you had to have the right gesture. You had to push and turn the oyster and pull it in one swift move, like this. Sometimes when the oyster, it happened that the bottom of the oyster was buried in the red-colored sand. And there were some who said, "It's coral, it's coral." Alas, it was not coral, because the bottom of the oyster was always tinged with red. There was an expression that said, "It is red as coral." We spoke about it the way one can speak of gold. It was something rare. Hey, coral, he has a coral pendant. And it seems that the coral from Bonifacio is a quality that is out of the ordinary. The streams in Bonifacio are crossed by currents, rich in organic particles that constitute the food of the coral. This abundance gives it exceptional quality. Specialists say that a simple flick on the branch makes a clear sound that is inimitable, signature of this usual source. For centuries, the Mediterranean was the cradle of great civilizations that have used, revered, and distributed red coral to the Orient, India, Asia, and Africa. Its fishing remained archaic for centuries. It is only very recently, thanks to the evolution of technology, that a few scuba diving pioneers have modernized its gathering. My name is Serge Andrieux, and I began to fish coral in Italy. I started living like this, and then I bought a small boat, and then after a bigger one, and then we did not have sonars, we had rampini. That's to say that we had a big rope that was hung to a piece of scrap metal. We hung it on the back of the boat and pulled it across the bottom of the water. When it clung on to something, we went down to see what there was. So sometimes we had pieces of rock with coral or with no coral, but we never went too deep. We went to 40 meters maximum. When we arrived in the area of Bonifacio, the first time I dove, I didn't find a single piece of coral. At the time, we were the first to dive and did not find any coral, even though it was everywhere. But I found a piece of coral on a point of rock there, and I told my friend, "Over there, there's a little bit, let's try to go." That was already at 70 meters. He dives, and he runs the rock, and there was a giant cliff, maybe 10 or 15 meters high and 100 meters long, and there were branches that were like that. It was America. It really was America. Afterwards, we started like that and then continued. The most beautiful coral fishing dive. I'm certainly the one who made it. At the time, when I was in Civitavecchia, I began, it was the second year, then I took a rock. It was 25 meters and it was full of coral. There were branches, I touched the rock, and the branches came up under my arm. What length it was. So for 25 meters I filled my basket, then I got back, I emptied my cart, and then I went back down. And it was like that. I filled the basket, and I'm sure I must have had at least 70 kilos of coral. If you want to go out fishing with someone and go out to sea, you must go out with Rémi Oreille. He will definitely take you. I fished coral with his father at the time, where the fuel pump is on the port of Bonifacio. My name is Rémi Oreille. I'm a diver, a coral fisherman from Bonifacio. I've been doing this for 14 years. When I was a kid, I went out often with my father. That's what made me want to do this job, I think. There's my brother who worked with me. He had an accident in the 90s, and he stayed at the bottom. There are lots of coral fishermen who stay at the bottom. We're talking about approximately 50% of coral fishermen who have died. Because it's a dangerous business, there are a lot of diving levels to respect. And if there's any sort of technical problem, any problem at all, failure of air, a regulator that breaks, we cannot emerge. If we surface immediately without leveling off, we die. So I decided to stop completely for my family, for my mother. So I started to rent road bikes, and I was there not far from the boats, and I could see the boats depart every day. And I was a little bit bitter, you see. And I realized that my life was not to rent bikes. My life is the sea, here. She gave me everything, the sea, but she also took everything back in a way. It can give you all the joy you want, but also pain. After that, it was stronger than me, and I returned to work despite my mother and my whole family, who is against it. My father, when he first came here, it was almost pristine. He did 10 kilos at each dive. Now it's 300, 400, 500 grams, painfully collected, sometimes a kilo. So it becomes difficult, especially since we're trying to harvest coral that is big enough. So we don't touch the little ones. We leave them. So if we reach the rock that's white with coral, but it's all very small, we leave it and don't touch it. We try to choose a colony's most beautiful coral branches. That's the way it works. That's why when I dive on rocks that my father worked on 20 or 25 years ago, I can still find some coral, and I leave some myself for future generations who'll be willing to fish for coral. Red coral is white at the bottom, because when you approach the rock, at least from afar, after approaching we can see that it's red, but it looks white because the coral's polyps are out. Actually, from afar, it looks white. We call them flowers. They're not flowers, they're an animal, but it looks like a flower at the bottom. I liken it a bit to that. From afar, it looks like a small garden. A garden of coral. Red coral has been described by Cuvier, the great naturalist of the 18th century, as part of the corallium genus, which is not the case with some other precious corals, such as black coral. Do not try to compare it to warm water corals either. Very porous, these develop at shallow depths and form barriers and atolls. The coral fishermen each have their own hunting ground, whose location remains secret. Here we see the break of the rock. We clearly see that there are holes in it, from 68 to 70 meters. It's perhaps even going to drop a little to 72. Here's still that little rock there, a small, tiny rock. To the sand, there's 72 meters. And the coral, you find it between what and what depths? It's found at 60 meters. Now we're no longer allowed to dive in an area which is set at 50 to 60 meters. We cannot touch it anymore. So it's often at 65 to 90 to 100 meters. There I threw a stone in to find the rock. So we see with the sonar when to throw it. We throw the top of the rock, then we tag it with a buoy, and with the long rope we leave it so that we can see the direction of the current, you see? So the current comes from out at sea. Therefore, it's not at random. We already mark the orientation with the rock by the sun, And then later with the sonar it shows where there are caves. If there are crevices, and with experience, and with a little bit of luck, we know what we find. We have a new piece of equipment, they're called ROV. It's a motorized robot that goes underwater so that we can find the bottom before diving, so that we don't dive for nothing. There's a lot of diving for nothing. Often it's capo, that is to say zero, nothing. The coral fisherman is equipped with multiple wetsuits to protect against the cold. Indeed, the temperature of the water passes quickly from the surface at 26 degrees to 12 degrees at 80 feet deep. To descend rapidly to the bottom, in addition to the weight belts, he puts in his basket a huge block of stone. A few meters from the destination, he needs to remove this block from the basket and throw it out so as to slow down his speed, thus avoiding hitting the bottom. Here I cannot take my eyes off him. I must constantly monitor the bubbles. The bubbles accelerate whenever he exhales into the regulator. When they're concentrated in one place, that means he's not moving. He stays put. Sometimes it can be distorted because, depending on his depth, the bubbles can be swept away by the current. So we have to anticipate that, relative to the current, and locate him by the rise of the bubbles on the surface. Upon arrival at the bottom, time presses. The coral fisherman must begin his harvest. He has only 1/4 of an hour to collect the maximum amount of red coral. All material must be absolutely reliable during the dive. A commonplace occurrence, like a breakdown of the flashlight, would be fatal for the harvest and would involve the loss of a full day's work. At this depth, brightness is very low, and colors are uniform. It is impossible, without a light supply, to distinguish the red coral. The diver, absorbed in his search, should nevertheless be extremely attentive to the time elapsed. He must pay attention to undercurrents that can take him drifting very far from his original location. A calm sea at the surface is not necessarily so at such depths. Stocks of red coral have declined significantly, but ironically, we cannot say that it is a species nearing extinction. Indeed, this body becomes fertile when it reaches a certain size of a few centimeters. The coral fishermen do not take these small branches that have no commercial value. Thus, in some regions, at lower depths, they grow in great quantities. Coral reproduction happens as there are two separate sexes. It's impossible to distinguish them with the naked eye, but there are male and female colonies. After internal fertilization, small ciliated larvae will attach to a wall, forming a small hill from which will appear the first polyp. Coral growth is extremely slow. It's difficult to date the age of a branch, but it's obvious that a colony that's over 1 kilo in weight is undoubtedly several centuries old. You can have bad encounters, certainly it's happened. And so we have to have means of persuasion or repulsion, or even a weapon, to stop it when we're down there. We're talking about sharks. There are more and more sharks present in our Mediterranean waters, which are warming more and more. 15 minutes have passed. The harvest must end. The coral fisherman opens the lift parachute, which he attaches to his basket full of precious scarlet branches. This is the sign for the captain that the gathering is complete. Now we must act quickly because the long climb back, allowing for the diver's decompression, begins. He passes him the hose, which is an endless tube, a sort of umbilical cord linking him to the boat. It consists of an air supply, hot water, and a microphone for communicating with the captain. All this will help the coral fishermen to take more than 2.5 hours of leveling off and waiting at different depths, a process vital to avoid an embolism, which is the main cause of fatal accidents in this trade.
Tu me reçois, Rémi? Tu me reçois? C'est bon pour toi au fond? Aller chercher du corail quand on est seul, c'est du suicide.
Fetching coral when you're alone, it's suicide. I think if people do, they shouldn't admit it proudly. And then it's against the rules for professional diving. At 70 or 75 meter depths, we're subject to narcosis. And for those who are not used to it, after 10 or 15 meters, they're in narcosis. It's a supersaturation, which is due to nitrogen in the blood. So that's to say, they no longer really have any concept of reflexes. Sometimes when you see a fish next to you, you'd like to emulate it. You withdraw your regulator, you breathe in the water, and drown. That's happened often. The way we're equipped and organized on board, we've managed to perform without having any accidents. Then if there are really rough seas, we use what you see here, the decompression chamber. So the diver sends me a signal saying, prepare the chamber. In 3 minutes, he comes straight back up to the surface and enters the chamber immediately.
Bienvenue à bord.
Not much.
Ils ont nous donné avec les filets peut-être.
Ah, ils ont passé déjà. C'est plein de fils.
Plein de fils.
Aujourd'hui.
When I arrived, it was a small rock like that. I saw sea fans in the distance. I approached, and the cliff was on another side. It fell for about 15 meters and was super, super beautiful. There were holes, caves, not much coral, but it was beautiful. That's some little coral. The fishing season runs between May and October, during which weather conditions are favorable. The coral fisherman performs hundreds of dives per year. They're not all successful. He often comes up to the surface with an empty basket. My name is Jean-Marie Dominici. I'm an agent of the National Park, in charge of the Scandola Natural Reserve Project. As you can see, Scandola is a living laboratory. Scientific activity is very important here. On the coral today, for the past 5 years, the Scandola Reserve team has been working with the CNRS in Marseille on an issue that we've noticed since 2003, since the Mediterranean began to warm, because of the big heat wave that we had. We noticed that there was a lot of necrosis at the cnidaire and gorgonian coral. Now, between 15 and 25 meters, there's a lot of warming, and necrosis happens often. So the goal and the challenge was to remove the coral and to take it beyond 30 meters in depth to make it out of reach for the warming of the Mediterranean. So this method was developed by the CNRS. It allows to remove the coral and place it in a place where it's out of reach of the hot waters. It's a world first in this respect. So in situ, in the Scandola Reserve, the CNRS teams come twice a year to see the animal behavior after this change. Since 2003, all's gone well. The reactivity of the coral is positive, and it's had normal growth in terms of diameter and length, and each colony seems to be doing well. Coral as a resource is diminishing, but we cannot say it's endangered. Today, with this type of process, we'll be able to relocate it. This will be a long-time reserve at Scandola. It is a tool to show the way this sort of process could be done on a larger scale in the Mediterranean, to launch a comprehensive policy for management of the Mediterranean and beyond.
My
name is Roger Miniconi. I'm a consultant in the marine environment. Scandola Reserve was created in 1975. We decided to create a reserve that would combine protection for the sea and the land. It's the first time in Corsica, and probably in France, that we are having a total protection of the seabed. While the regulation of fishing in the Mediterranean is very diverse, it is true that it gives rise to a number of farms that are destroying the wildlife and environment with their fishing gear, such as the Cross of St. Andrew, which normally is not adopted, but which are devices that are quite destructive. So it's true that something needs to be done at a European level, not without going as far as imposing a ban, as was advocated by non-governmental organizations like the WWF of Europe. Coral has always been a mystery since men have first used it. They have asked about its nature. We know that the use of coral existed 25,000 years ago, since it was found in a tomb in Wiesbaden in Austria. Dioscorides, the Greek scholar of the 1st century, said it was a vegetable, but as soon as they touched it, it materialized into stone. It was not until the 18th century when a scientist discovered the true nature of coral by taking branches and putting them in water. He saw them agitate on the surface, small animals, and that's how the true nature of coral was discovered. Coral is a small bag-shaped animal. It lives in a colony. It takes the calcium in the water and builds a mineral skeleton, a sort of skeleton group. All of the small polyps live on the surface of this mineral skeleton. There is a collective organization for all the acts of life, for collecting food, etc.
Pour la nourriture et pour tous les actes de la vie.
They feed on plankton, which are very small particles of plants and animals that live in seawater and are brought to them by the current and the movement of the sea. The structure of coral is limestone, but it's stained red by iron oxide and is more or less tinted. That is to say that the concentration of iron oxide is more or less important when it is in the coral. When there is more iron oxide, it is oxblood, very red coral. When there is less iron oxide, it is slightly lighter red, or red-pink. Well, the parish of Porto Vecchio is preparing to celebrate its patron saint, John the Baptist. And in this city of sea and salt, the good Saint John the Baptist was chosen by the ancients as the patron saint to watch over the entire population, all those who arrive by sea in this city, and all those who depart. One could say that coral was used in our region as an instrument to Christianize society, because it makes religious symbols that symbolize the Christian faith. Tonight, when we go out into the streets with the image of John the Baptist, you see, we will make a stop in front of the door of the oldest church in the city, facing the sea, and we will invoke the name of John the Baptist.
Tournés vers la mer, nous invoquerons Saint Jean-Baptiste.
In every house there was a small piece of coral lying about. We'd have a piece of coral. When babies were born, they were not baptized, so they would put coral in his hand. It was a gesture that was made to protect from the evil eye. When someone said something along the lines of, "Oh, this baby's so beautiful," we would make this gesture, and that is why it's reproduced here. And it seems that before they used to think that little pieces of coral would ward off the evil eye. In Corsica, the Regional Administration of Maritime Affairs, in agreement with the Association of Coral Fishermen, decided to limit their number to approximately 10, and put in place a system that does not allow harvesting of coral above 60 meters in depth.
Alors que l'autre est un peu plus quand même sport, voilà, plus sport.
Alors j'ai créé à Porto Vecchio la taillerie du corail il y a une trentaine
I created the Porto Vecchio coral lapidary about 30 years ago. The difference in coral in Corsica is really the color. Everything has an amazing hue. The quality can be very good, very clear, and also very bad. Not really a criterion. Today it affects price a bit. Of course, there are very few dark red corals. The most common are the corals here in the center. Then there's the quality of the material and the quality of craftsmanship. If coral is attacked by parasites, they will leave a mark, and the coral becomes excessively porous and can no longer make beautiful Baroque pieces or beautiful necklaces. The highest quality work will be applied on beautiful coral, and we will make smaller pieces with the smaller or damaged coral. Unfortunately, there is also fake coral. I can show you this coin, for example. It's called bamboo. It's a white coral from the Pacific that's tinted red, used extensively in jewelry. And I think now is a great disservice to our profession. Then on the market, we find a lot of this coral, which is a natural coral. It's precious, but then it is polished and shined and varnished, and comes from the Pacific at Horn's Reef. Of course, if we were using only Corsican coral, we wouldn't be able to find balls like this, 14 millimeters wide. Then, of course, there's red resin. Thousands of workshops in the south of Italy are forced to work with this in order to maintain their business. That's one of the major concerns today in our profession. We work with coral in our workshop, and we import it to Torre del Greco in Italy, where a lot of coral from Corsica goes and is worked by different collaborators. I have to go there one of these days, and if you're interested, I can introduce you to our employees at Torre del Greco. When coral is out of water, it is covered with a skin called coenchyme. This organic matter is removed through washing prior to the sale of the branches by local fishermen. Coral is bought in part by Neapolitans who, after working it, dispatch it all over the world. If they come out here, and they come almost every week. In southern Italy, near Naples, Torre del Greco is a small city of 100,000 inhabitants at the foot of Vesuvius. From the 16th century, it was distinguished by its fleets and artisans who specialize in what they still call red gold, which is none other than coral. Over 7,000 people visit this famous city from around the world for its art cameos carved on shells and its work on corals. My name is Crescenzo Gaglione. I'm a professor at the Art Institute of Torre del Greco, where I teach engraving on coral, shells, and cameos.
Dove insegno l'incisione su coralli, conchiglie e cammei.
Currently, we're in the Church of St. Mary of Constantinople, historically the most important church of Torre del Greco. It was founded in 1650. At the time, Torre del Greco was already having a fleet of corallières, very large, no fewer than 400 boats that went out and fished coral into the Mediterranean.
Si pensi che si raggiungeva il numero di 400 barche per andare a pescare il corallo in tutto il Mediterraneo.
What is the origin of this Church of St. Mary of Constantinople? In the 15th century, during a war between the Barbary pirates and the fishermen from Torre del Greco, they found a wooden statue, now known as St. Mary of Constantinople, preserved in the niche at the back of the church.
La cosiddetta famosa statua Santa Maria di Costantinopoli, attualmente in fondo alla chiesa, nella nicchia.
Many faithful still come to pray at the feet of Our Lady of Coral Fishermen.
Sono Antonino De Simone e sono l'erede di una tradizione familiare antica. La storia della mia famiglia si intreccia.
My name is Antonino De Simone, and I am an heir of an ancient family tradition. The story of my family is intimately linked with the story of the coral, because Torre del Greco was a fishing reef. At Torre del Greco, it was Bartolomeo Martin who brought the first work of a coral in 1805. But already, in the 1st century, Pliny, the Roman geographer, said that red coral was very common in India, and this indicates that it existed for some centuries. It was a subject of trade between the Mediterranean and India. The work of coral was brought here by a Frenchman from Marseille, Bartolomeo Martin, in 1805.
È venuto qui nel 1805, ha chiesto ai Borboni.
He asked for help from the Bourbons and received it and opened his first workshop. Throughout history, coral has fascinated men and women of power. My name is Claudette Joannes. I'm curator here at the National Museum of Malmaison. Josephine will be remembered as a very attractive woman who had an absolute love for dresses and jewelry, a love that was encouraged by her husband, Napoleon, who wanted Josephine to be the ambassador of luxury, as well as all that could be produced in France. For her, it was not difficult to spend. She had in her home here in Malmaison and in the Tuileries large amounts of closet in which she had all these gorgeous dresses, and also jewelry boxes where she kept this multitude of ornaments that were sumptuous: diamonds, rubies, emeralds, enamel, but also coral. Most of the jewels that were made in the workshops of Torre del Greco.
I petali di fiore.
Sì. Allora.
C'è la parte scura.
Sì.
There are roses that are mounted on rings and earrings. These are interesting because they're fairly average size and therefore quite commercial. These are roses that are cut entirely by hand and have a lot of relief, unlike some that lie fairly flat.
Contrairement à certaines qui sont assez plates.
My name is Ferdinando D'Amato, and my profession is architect of coral. We've been doing this business for 3 generations. My grandfather fished coral, then my father started to work it, and finally I continued the work of my father, with success, I hope. Here's the coral as it is when it emerges from the sea. These are the most beautiful branches, of course. It comes from Sardinia and Corsica.
Per cui I nostri avi che pescavano il corallo, non sapendo accidarlo.
In our case, this came about at a time where there was a crisis of coral, and our ancestors who fished in the reef, finding no buyers, began to work it.
Questa è la storia iniziale del corallo. E poi sono sorte tante aziende.
In some ways, it was imposed by the market. This is the beginning of the story. Then other companies started, always around the coral, each one specializing in something else. It looks easy, but it takes a lot of experience to work the coral, and each step involved requires a different person. There are those who cut, those who shape it, those who bore holes, and those who polish it. These are very different tasks, and it's rare to find someone who knows how to do them all.
Modi di lavorazione.
We specialize in beads, which is what sells the most, for cabochons or jewelry. Or, when specific work requires it for fine jewelry, specific forms to mount into gold. We need a reserve of coral supply because every month does not lend itself to fishing. We need to use a stock when we're unable to fish. We keep it in a warehouse, but our stock is running out because there's been no fishing for several months.
Per cui noi abbiamo bisogno dello stock per prelevare del corallo quando il pescato non c'è. E quindi abbiamo i depositi con del corallo che poi utilizzeremo, che si stanno pure esaurendo queste scorte perché sono molti mesi che non stanno pescando.
Like a treasure, Ferdinando D'Amato's reserve is hidden in an impenetrable chest with exceptional coral branches. Selected from the finest sources and stored for many years, they seem to have lost their colors. But nothing but a simple polishing will make them vibrant again.
Adesso, dopo aver visto il corallo...
After having shown you the raw coral as it emerges from the sea, I'll show you the work on Pacific coral. I'll show you a pink coral statue. It's a beautiful coral called angel skin.
Di corallo rosa, che è uno specifico corallo molto bello, si chiama peau d'ange, o pelle d'angelo detto in italiano.
It's a work by one of what I believe to be the greatest sculptors of coral, Carlo Parlati. My name is Henry Delaz, and I'm the founder and president of Comex, company founded in 1961. In 1969 or 1970, I drew my first submarine, which was then sent to Taiwan. We had the opportunity, thanks to the adventurous spirit of our patron, to leave for several months and work on the island of Taiwan, to fish coral in the depths averaging 300 meters. It was one of the most beautiful adventures of my life. This was in 78 and 79, and we found coral branches that were 1 meter long, or 1 meter 10, and the largest of which weighed 22 kilos. There was a 25-kilo branch which was too large to be sold, completely unique piece, and we couldn't get a good price for it, so we brought it back. It came by plane, of course. It landed here with us. We'd never seen a flight before with Comex. I say this with pride. But the next day, the branch was gone. I'm Alfonso Vitelio. Our company is passed on from father to son in the Delia family on my mother's side. We are one of the leading companies in Torre del Greco, working with coral and cultured pearl trade with Asia. We'll start by going back in time, and I'll show you the coral among the oldest in the Mediterranean. It was caught in Italy on 3 fishing grounds which belonged to 3 cities: Trapani, Messina, and Siacca. This type of coral has a very specific color: orange. Now we move on to a coral that we sell a lot of and that comes from the Asian seas, and Japan in particular. The colors are extremely bright red to orange or salmon.
I colori pure qua vanno da un rosso acceso a un arancione, o meglio salmonato, meglio conosciuto proprio.
Then we move on to the most beautiful coral, the angel skin.
Il corallo tra i più belli, ed è la pelle d'angelo. Qua notiamo la grandezza delle collane.
Here we can notice the large size of the beads, which go from 14 to 20 to 25 millimeters for the central bar. It is the size of the raw coral that allows for this type of work, which would be impossible with the coral of the Mediterranean, because the branches are too thin.
È molto piccola come materiale grezzo.
Often confused with a plant, it is at the boundary of the animal and the mineral. The red gold of the Mediterranean, a gift from the gods, forever fascinating man, tiny, fragile, in the midst of the immensity of the abyss.